Now, that one out there. This cello was made in 1662 by Niccolo Amati in a little town in northern Italy, Cremona. He was really the first great Italian violin maker, cello maker. He made a lot of instruments, 13 cellos, as a matter of fact, fewer cellos, of course, than violins. He was also a very great teacher. He was a teacher of Stradivarius. Strad was 18 years old and an apprentice with him when this particular cello was made. He was also the teacher of other great Italian violin makers. The cello was rather late in developing as a solo instrument. That is, you know, when you think of, for example, that Liszt played the piano probably as well as it's played today, technically. And for that matter, the violin, which was, of course, a much earlier instrument to emerge as a solo instrument, was probably played as well by Paganini as it's played today. We had to wait for Pablo Casals to come along to really master and improve the contemporary techniques, fingerings, and of course style. He was a great artist and a great musician. For example, when this cello was made in 1662, these particular instruments were used mainly in the bass line in secular music, in church music, in cantatas. They played the bass line. And as a result, many of them were called bassettos in those years. Some of the very large strads, for example, were originally bassettos. And also, this instrument is called the grand pattern Amati. But in the evolution of the instrument then, of course, the pedagogy began to improve. And that is one of the things that we want to talk about today, because it's one of the things that interests me so much as a teacher. For example, when I was a young man, there were very few, comparatively fewer cellists, fine cellists, than there were violinists or pianists. Today, I think there is a kind of renaissance in the cello, and I think one of the reasons this has happened, it's not only because of the great masters like Rostropovich and Casals and Feuermann and Piatigorsky, but it also happens today that there are many great young players because the teaching has improved so much, and I like to think that I have taken some responsibility for that. I've taught for over 30 years at the Juilliard and about 11 years at Curtis, and I've had the privilege of turning out with some wonderful young people. As a teacher, I have been concerned so many times sitting at examinations at the Juilliard or the Curtis and listening to young people and watching young people, because I'm very much interested in schooling, how they use, let us say, the right arm. For me, the bow, or the right arm, is perhaps the least understood and more often than not just simply not very well taught. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I believe. You see, as a teacher, I am not one who believes in direct imitation, because I mean, imitation is all right, and there's bound to be some subconscious imitation. If a teacher is a fine performer, the student is going to imitate, whether consciously or subconsciously. Ideal, however, with the things that for me are really important. That is, what constitutes the differences in players. And there have to be differences in players. You know, it is not the instrument itself. I mean, some people say, yes, you have a gorgeous cello, so you sound better. Well, I think it's an advantage, but I don't think it's that great an advantage, because after all, if you think for a moment that the distance between the bridge and the nut is the same on this cello as it is on my student's cellos, or any other cellos, and the distance from the point of the bow to the frog, or this end of the bow, is also the same. So therefore, the teacher really must deal with the differences that exist in human beings. Some are tall, some are short, some have long arms, some have short arms, some have longer fingers, shorter fingers, and those differences have to be dealt with. So the thing that I try to do in teaching is set up a series of basic principles that I like to try and sort of work around in terms of teaching the bow to students. There are three things that go into the production of good right-hand sound. Three elements that are all totally interrelated with each other. For example, if I do for you, I mentioned three elements. Now, that's not a bad sound. The first element is pressure on the bow, how much or how little. And you can tell in this case there's considerable because you can see the stick bending. Element number two, speed of the bow, how fast, how slow. In this particular case, again, if you notice, the speed of the bow is rather slow. Element number three is what I sort of took the word from Mr. Galamian, who is a very great violin teacher, perhaps one of the greatest in the world. That word is sound point. Where we play with the bow between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge, if you will notice very carefully, the sound point is quite deep. It's quite near the bridge. Now, I mentioned that these three elements were totally interrelated with one another. Supposing, for example, I do not make adjustments for the pressure or the speed of the bow, but I simply move the sound point back. Let's see what happens. First-class noise. On the other hand, if I lighten the pressure and increase the speed, I have a very nice, different kind of sound. And I think it is very important that the players utilize those differences in sound the way a painter will utilize his marvelous different reds and purples and greens, because that is color too. Sound is color. Now, what does this have to do with the basic problems that we have at hand of teaching the bow? Well, these three things, for example. If the student is tight, if the student has great tension, look here, it does take a certain amount of effort to play one of these things. I'm not saying that you can, play it as though you're falling off a log. You can't do that. But on the other hand, you also cannot be tight. I have seen so many problems with tightness. Generally, I would say that the tightness that I have noticed, so much of it starts up around the neck region, the shoulder region. You will find students doing this type of thing, raising of this shoulder, and that shoulder has to be absolutely in place. Now, by raising that shoulder, what do? They run the risk of losing the sound point so that it will not sound. So now, I look for, as an experienced teacher, I looked for little telltale signs of tightness. I watch the student very often. I'll go over and feel their right shoulder, see what sort of tension there is. Also, I can tell from their breathing or lack of breathing. Very often, if they're tense and tight, they will do this sort of thing as they're playing, you know. And they cannot breathe freely. And of course, one has to be able to breathe freely, because otherwise the sound will be affected. The other little signs of tightness that I've learned to recognize are little facial grimaces. Oh, I don't mean the kind of intensity that one will get when one performs, but I mean things like this, with the mouth, for example, or if I see the neck tight. That's an indication to me that I have to watch that person and that I have to try and make certain accommodations to help them lose some of that tightness. It's not easy, but that's one of the arts of teaching, and that must be. Now, just for a moment, I would like to tell you that I think that a string instrument really is a series of springs. Everything is a spring. Look here, the string is a spring. Notice how it moves? The hair is a spring. The stick is a spring. Here is a spring, a very important spring. In the hand. The wrist is a spring. Here is a spring, and here is a spring. They must all be capable of operation. What do I mean by that? I mean that if one locks the hand, and I've seen this so often, where the hand is absolutely like a piece of steel, the sound is going to sound like a piece of steel. It's going to sound hard. One can lock the thumb on the bow. I perhaps should have said that first. That the way to lock the hand on the bow is to play with a rigid, straight, inflexible thumb. It is possible to lock the hand on the bow two ways with the thumb, either this way with a straight thumb or with the thumb curved too much. In other words, a thumb with the rest of the hand has to be capable of movement, just like a skier's legs. You know, when he goes over bumps, his knees absorb some of the shocks. Same thing happens here with the bow. I give certain exercises for that, which I will demonstrate in a little while, but I think now I must talk a little bit about how the seating at the instrument is important. Most of the solo playing that we do on the cello is done on the A string. Unfortunately, this is one of the hardest strings to play on. Why? Because we have to be able to cut across that string at a proper angle. Now, mind you, I'm being very careful not to say to play with a straight bow, because such a thing does not exist. That was taught for years, and it is repeated today by many, many teachers. Straight bow, straight bow. It doesn't exist. We always bow in figure eights, but I have to come to that a little bit later. But I just thought I'd throw that in now, because I won't forget, because it's terribly important. But again, getting back to seating, we have to sit in such a way. Remember that none of these springs can be locked. These springs have to be capable of movement. So therefore, we have to be able to arrive at the point of the bow so that this is not locked, so that we can accomplish this. Now, depending upon a person's height, we can make certain adjustments for that. Some young people have shorter arms than I do. Some have longer arms. And adjustments have to be made. They can be made, incidentally, by various ways. If we do this, look at the difference of the angle in the bow to the string. For a person with short arms, they'd have to do something like this, so they would wind up doing that. You see, this really should be done with a head-on camera. But I think perhaps it's close enough. You see, the cello itself and the chair, if you will notice, are facing in that direction. My body, however, is facing in that direction, so that I am able to accomplish this. And I would like to say, I talked about general principles before. I think one of the general principles is that one has to be in a state of good balance in seating and also in holding of the bow. Now, if you ask 3 different teachers, well, what is good balance when you sit? You're likely to get 3 different answers. But I'm going to give you my answer because I think it's important. And this does work because I have had the pupils to prove it. That in sitting across the instrument, more or less, the instrument facing there, my body facing there, that most of our weight of our body, we should tend to gravitate towards the left side. As opposed to this. Now, I think it's terribly important. If you can envision for a moment the violinists as they stand to play on their instrument. They have the instrument here, and they're definitely gravitating to the left side. Now, that doesn't mean that they are not rotating. Of course they're rotating, as we, in fact, must rotate, too. We must rotate our body. We must rotate the instrument as well, because we have to accommodate the bow. And the body is an amazing piece of machinery if you just let it work. We play... You notice the leaning in this direction to get the low string up, or get the C string up so I can get a good shot at it with the bow. The beginning of the Don Quixote of Strauss. I mean, you cannot do that here because you're going to run into the leg with the bow. I'd like to talk now a little bit about the basic principles of holding the bow, because that, I think, is terribly important. I mentioned already as a basic principle the importance of keeping the thumb in a state of the capability and the capacity to be flexed. It is very important, and the other fingers as well. Because I might tell you that if the thumb is held in a straight, rigid fashion, it is not only the thumb that is tight, but the wrist gets tight too, and everything gets tight. So in terms of holding the bow, it is common sense to me that if we have 4 fingers on one side of the bow and only 1 lonesome finger on this side of the bow, that this 1 lonesome finger, the thumb, the player must in some way balance up with this 1 finger with the strongest of those 4, which is definitely the middle finger. No question of it. The violinists balance up definitely between the thumb and the 2nd finger. The cellists tend more to balance between the 2nd and the 3rd finger. Well, as a matter of fact, I'd like to continue with one more thing that I just thought of that's terribly important with the bow, and that is the actual placement of the fingers on the bow. I don't think there are any 2 people that hold the bow exactly the same. But again, so as a basic principle, I do not believe that we should ever allow our fingers to go above the 2nd joint. This being the 2nd joint, this the 1st joint. Somewhere around the 1st, between the 1st and the 2nd joints of the fingers. That's the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd finger. 4th finger is a little higher up. It's a shorter finger. The other things about holding the bow, about the basic position, is that the arm must be pronated. Pronation meaning this as opposed to that. Pronation of the arm is terribly important because this is the direct line of a continuation of the arm. excuse me just a moment, for me, the long note is the E natural, not the F sharp. Despite the fact that the F sharp is a half note and the E natural is a quarter, the quarter has a fermata on it. So in the cadenza, that is a little bit longer, F sharp note.
Just a little, you know, it's afro the dissonance, D.
The other point,
I like to. I see the difference between the two of you, and I think I like it. I think one should hold people in suspense with F sharp. What's going to happen?
what about that fermata that Beethoven wrote?
But you know, I think it's a nice idea to wait a little bit on it.
Well, there are lots of things that are nice ideas. He marks on that cadenza. Now, I teach the bow in the following fashion. I like to split the bow in half. I'm going to talk now only about the physiological movements of the right arm, how it works, how I teach the bow. There are many other approaches to it, but I believe there is a great deal of truth in what I have to say. Now, I teach the bow. First of all, I get the grip fairly settled with the students and the seating so that they can accomplish the things that we spoke of before to accommodate each string with the bow. Now, I teach the bow in the following fashion. I split the bow in half for the students, and I will teach from the frog to the middle. In case some of the listeners and people who are watching do not understand, this part of the bow is called the frog, this of course being the tip, but I don't know where the frog came from, Frosch in German, but that's what it's called. So I teach the bow usage in the following fashion. Frog to the middle, middle to the frog. Mind you, I'm not speaking right now about the bow change. That's vitally important, but I will speak about that a little later. I'm just speaking about the basic arm movement, which is terribly important. This, naturally, if you take a good, careful, close look, all I am doing is opening and closing the elbow. Notice this staying in place. No lifting of the shoulder. Very important. Also, you will notice something else. Remember those three things I spoke about earlier in terms of bow pressure, speed, sound point. Notice that I'm not indulging in any ice skating on the strings, so that even this should sound good. Everything should sound good. I'd like to mention one thing else, too, that I think is terribly important as a basic principle. I do not believe in playing with flat hair. I believe the bow should always be towards the direction of the bridge. The relationship of the hair and the stick should be in that direction, not this direction. Now, there are some people who play with a less taut bow than I do, and they have a slight rollover technique at the point. That is perfectly acceptable. But down here, the bow should be on its side, because really, when we attack a note very strongly, like Dvorak concerto, the hair is a ribbon of hair. It flattens out by itself. It's flat now, even though the basic direction of the bow is this. It's a very important point. I think that the amount of slugging of the instrument that goes on, especially with cellists, one finds a lot of that. I mean, they will attack the string. For example, they will start, let us say, Elgar concerto in this fashion, which starts. Now, in the next E minor chord, they will come crashing down. So you hear that type of thing. Instead of, for example, in other words, I do believe, as I'm sure you will agree to, that there is a kind of platform here that one has to find and then find the string with a hand, but it is from the string. It is not from the air. Let's get back to those half bows because they're They're sort of that's the start. That's the basic thing, the grip, the seating. Oh, let me mention one thing about the seating. You know, I think I have never taught a student yet who hasn't exaggerated everything that I've said. I have said to students, you know, gravitate towards your left side. The next week they come back, you know, this way. Well, obviously, I'm not talking about that. I mean, we're on our right side, too, but we tend, with most of the way, we play in that direction. No question of it, and so do the violinists. And we also indulge in rotation. Now, again, back to the half bows. So, now, the basic arm movement. Now, you will notice very carefully that I am taking great pains to drop the elbow back. This is very important. It is important because the weight of the arm is there to help us. We know, for example, to make the same amount of sound here at the tip of the bow that we make at the frog, it takes considerably more pressure. Actually, somebody once figured out that it takes 17.5 times as much pressure. Well, I think that's a very fine piece of information, but it's not the scale that I use. This is a scale that I use. How does it sound? I'm not interested. Yes, I know that it takes more pressure. But now I would like to discuss the upper half of the bow, because that is the vital part of the bow. That is the part of the bow that most cellists do not use well for a very simple reason. It's more difficult. One of the great differences between the violin and the cello is the fact that the violin bow is quite a bit easier to use here and much harder to use here. For us, it's just the opposite. It's much easier to use here and much more difficult to use here. So I think the students should pay very careful attention to this, because now I have discussed this and the importance of that and this, and not slipping on the strings. Okay, now let's see what happens physiologically now. From the middle to the point. This is very important. Notice sounds. You hear the ring of the instrument. You hear the overtone. You hear the octave power. That has to be. But also, let's see what's going on here. Notice that I'm going out and down, back and up, out and down, back and up, out and down, so that as I sit here, I can see a triangle. 1, 2, 3. Let's talk about that stroke a little bit. Remember, everything has to sound. Everything has to sound well. That stroke, let's talk about it. What is that stroke called? The Italians have a word for it. It's called Martelé. Also the French. Martelé. Martelé is very important because of its relationship to détaché, or detached bows. Who said there was such a thing as a straight bow? Take a look at that. What's going on there? Half moons, huh? Half moons, You want a bow straight? Do this. Everything sounds, and everything is tight, and nothing sounds. So, that bowing is terribly important. And I would suggest to the players, of course, one has to make an adjustment for the curvature of the bridge. It's going to be a little more pronounced here on the A string than it is on the D, less on the G, and less on the C, because the bridge is curved. So I would suggest to the players that they start off, if their bow arm is not well schooled, they start off by doing something like this, taking a simple scale and using just these half bows, not trying to change the bow smoothly, because I will talk about the change of bow in a little while, because I feel the change of bow is vitally important. But I would suggest that the students do. What is that? It's a simple scale where I'm doing half bows. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. You see the arm working? You see that it's how I've tried to describe it as best I can. But I think in teaching, it is very important in teaching a string instrument that we must learn to go slowly. I do not like to leave a student unless he knows this already, because then I can take it one step further and I can go on. Once a student can do this, you know, it will depend on the state of their abilities when they come to me. Usually when I get students on the college level, somebody's already messed them up, and I have to unmess, which is not easy. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the change of bow and the pulling of the sound and what is important, because I described before to you that the bow operates in figure eights. And I want to show you some of those figure eights, and I want to show you what happens. There are little circles that happen out here, for example, and also here. If you watch this end of the bow here, and you watch this end of the bow here, you will see little circles, or figure eights. This type of figure eight. That's the way the arm works, provided this is not tight and tense. All right. Now, that one out there. Dunas was a very interesting man who talked about the paintbrush theory in changing bows, and his version of the paintbrush theory was the way we change a bow. For example, paintbrush theory. If one were going to paint this beautiful surface, one would put a brush on its side, pull it along, and the brush would flip over. And the arm, what happens then? The arm precedes the flipping over. It's called the paintbrush theory. Now, he applied it to this, which is in other words, while we're going in this direction, the arm is already going in that direction. Now, I consider that vitally important because of the pulling of the sound. I feel that this is a trigger mechanism. This is a trigger mechanism. You cannot have this without that. There is a point at which the elbow is almost pointing down to the floor. It comes in. We have to coax the sound. We have to plead. Come on, baby, speak. We have to plead with it, the sound. You cannot pressure it. It will not come out with brute force. Now, that's our easy part of the bow. Our more difficult part of the bow. And because there is much more pressure here, we can do much less of this because we have to hang on to the bow. So that this again becomes a kind of trigger. Notice the differences in the level as we pull out and down, remember? It also is a very good idea for the students also to move with the bow, to move the body. This lateral movement is terribly important. Remember the violinists who also rotate as they play, and they rotate the instruments, and this is terribly important. Now, I have certain exercises that I give for this, and I think, again, I have borrowed one from my dear friend Ivan Galamian, who is, as I mentioned before, one of the great violin teachers of all times. Incidentally, there's nothing about this that is original. I haven't made up anything. I've just organized it in my own mind, And I think I've been smart enough to steal from some pretty good people and to steal some good ideas, and I think this is important. And but these organized ideas I can give to other people, and this is important. Mr. Galamian showed me this exercise many years ago, and I have adapted it for the cello. It is different on the violin because their whole position is different. You see, they too play with the bow towards the bridge, but their bridge is on this side. Ours is down here. So in adapting it for the cello, I have taught the students this. He calls this exercise, another French word, coller. But you see, it bears a relationship to what I was doing before of up and down, back and up. Only I'm doing this is as a dry exercise. This exercise is meant really for those players who are very tight. And the exercise really consists of straight, bend, or not really literally straight, because straight would be that, and we don't want that. But in terms of getting an idea across to the student, you say straight, bend, from the wrist down. Again, we're pronating, remember, not supinating, pronating, and we go. Now you notice the rocking movement of the bow. This rocking movement is very important, but we must not rock the ship. We must not do this. Because if we do this, if we do this sort of thing, by that, I don't know whether the camera can catch this, but what I'm trying to do is to show again how important it is to have the proper relationship between the stick and the hair and the string and the bridge. In other words, out and down, back and up. I have my pupils do all sorts of things. It's a kind of a dry exercise. I have them take the do pour etude number 7. Just for control, just doing that. Now, of course, we don't literally play that way, but as a warm-up exercise, as a cure for tightness, it is marvelous. I even have them do. It doesn't sound very pretty, but it's not meant to sound pretty. It's meant to loosen them up. It's meant to make them supple. There's one other thing that I just thought of that I would like to mention in terms of the bow and the pulling of the bow. The pulling of the bow, because when we change, we are literally pulling that bow here down, so that as one looks at it from this angle, you will see that in the pulling, this part of the hand definitely gets closer to the stick on the down bow than it does on the up bow. So that one is really pulling. Now, in terms of sound also, I think it is very important to add the function of the thumb as one approaches the tip of the bow. Because here we spoke about the natural weight of the arm. One can do that until the cows come home, because it's not a great effort, because the hand is supple and the weight of the arm comes into play, very important. However, the weight of the arm does not come into play when we go to the tip of the bow to make the same amount of sound. So therefore, we definitely, in terms of, remember those 3 things that I originally spoke of, pressure, speed, sound point. In terms of pressure, going to the point, as we go to the point, we will feel the thumb squeezing up into the second finger, so that this is exerted, this type of pressure. This all becomes very automatic, but, you know, after all, in teaching, one has to understand these problems in order to be able to try and explain them to young people. So that the function of the thumb and the counterbalance of these middle fingers, second finger, third finger, to the thumb. That's very important. Now, I think I've covered much of the material that I'll probably think of a million things once the cameras stop rolling, but at least...